Good morning. Welcome to another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all the places at Hawk Blogger. And it's a Friday. It is not a Blue Friday because the Seahawks season has concluded. It's come to its logical conclusion, I would say, as the Seahawks do not make the playoffs. They do finish with 10 wins, but we get to still talk to Mike Sando. It's such a pleasure, Mike, and I'm so glad that you and I agreed to talk throughout the playoffs because it's going to be a really fascinating first few weeks of the offseason for the Seahawks and the close of the season for the rest of these teams. How are you doing on this Friday?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm with you. I like the transition into this phase where we got coaching openings. We still have games playing. You get a little bit of everything, don't you? Hirings, firings.
You do.
High stakes games that matter. We even have a relocated game. There's all kinds of stuff going on.
Yes, I want to talk about that for sure. And I will say this, Mike. There's part of me that enjoys the offseason more.
Yes.
Especially when your team's not truly contending, because you don't have the pain of the ups and downs. You just have kind of the possibilities of what could be. And even the moves that maybe you're not quite as sure about, you don't really know whether they're good or bad until the season begins. So you can kind of talk yourself into, well, maybe that's a good move. So yeah,
I'm with you. I'm with you. Yeah, I love the offseason too.
There's so many interesting storylines, and one of them that we will spend a bunch of time on is the Seahawks did make their move at offensive coordinator. We'll talk about that in just a second. But before we get there, let's talk about some of the stuff going on in the NFL. Obviously, awful stuff happening in LA and continues to just kind of get worse, and lots of people losing their homes. And we won't go into detail about all the reactions to this, which have been kind of off the script from my perspective. But we do find out yesterday that the NFL has officially moved the Rams-Vikings wildcard game from SoFi Stadium to Glendale, Arizona, to play in Arizona on Monday night. A rare occurrence, and as much as I am not a Rams fan, I feel for Rams fans. I mean, that's pretty rough. Not only are they dealing with this tragedy, but their team does not get to play their playoff game at home.
Absolutely. I mean, I think because of the gravity of what's going on, it's not something you really complain about, right? This is still a game being played with a lot of, frankly, tragedy going on.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's in that context that we talk about it. And I did think from a football standpoint, what does this do for who's watching the games? Because if you're in LA, you could drive to Arizona, but there's a lot of reasons not to want to drive to Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
Do you just decide to sell your tickets? And then are the people buying the tickets a bunch of people who relocated from the Midwest to Minnesota, live in Arizona, and now you're going to have a borderline road game?
Yeah.
Which I don't think they would have had in LA. There'd be a good number of Viking fans there. There'd be a good number. But this just really does change the feel of the game from a Rams standpoint. It makes it much more challenging. I mean, they're like cutting short practice and stuff, yesterday, so people could get home. They closed the locker room early, and there was no media access because people had to get home to their homes. And now the logistics of suddenly changing to make it a road game is a big deal too, just internally, the whole clock and everything for everybody. So, it's all for the right reasons. It's the right thing to do, but it definitely has to disrupt the Rams.
Well, I mean, the reports we were getting yesterday about staff members running to their cars, it's scary stuff.
Oh, man.
And people, if there's gonna be people that are traveling to this game potentially with the team that don't know if their houses are going to be there when they get back. I mean, it's a significant type of situation we're talking about here. And I think with all that, there's the football part of it as well. And, the Rams, I don't know. I'm going to look up here in a second what their home. I don't sense that the Rams have been one of the teams that have one of the better home field advantages. It's not the most passionate fan base, but I think to your point, I think that there's a lot of Midwest folks that either moved to Arizona or winter in Arizona. And so what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of folks expecting this to be primarily a Vikings crowd. And the Rams fans also don't necessarily travel that well. So the line in this game started out as 2.5 points in favor of the Vikings. It moved down to 1 point, still with the Vikings as a favorite. It's now moved back up to 2.5 points. I mean, how much do you think this really, you could make the case that this is going to be a Rams team that's galvanized by what's going on. You could make the case that it's going to be a team distracted. What do you think that's how it's going to affect this game?
I don't think it's going to be an overly huge effect because it's not till Monday night. It's not like this is all happening tomorrow. They've got a little bit of time. So they basically knew on Thursday night that their game on Monday would be played in a different place, but not like a cross-country trip, right? I mean, it's going to be a quick trip. So I think there's time from a football standpoint to assimilate to the change and go out there and play, right? I don't think it's going to be. Now, we don't know what the emotional state of people is or their mind. I don't know that at all. I don't know how many of them have homes in that area or how they're actually feeling about the whole thing. That's on an individual basis. How would we know? There could be some people who just compartmentalize. It doesn't even affect them. There could be other people galvanized. There could be other people distracted. I don't know that at all, but I wouldn't think it would be, all in the same direction to totally affect the game.
Yeah, just to give you some hard numbers here, the Rams were 5-4 at home this year with a negative 11-point differential. So certainly not a strong home field advantage. They were 5-3 last year. They were 4-5 with a negative 8-point differential 2 years ago.
Yeah.
5-3 the year before that. So they have not been the most advantaged home field team. Not that the Seahawks have been either lately, but I think that ultimately, I still think this game is going to be decided by who's the better team. But I wish that we didn't have, for a lot of reasons, I wish we didn't have this additional layer of, obfuscation to the result involved.
But to me, it's of all the games that had to be moved, the one that's being played Monday night is the least disruptive.
Yeah. Any of the other games this weekend that have your particular attention?
Yeah. I think to me, Pittsburgh-Baltimore is really fascinating because, a month ago, everyone was singing Mike Tomlin's praises as his best coaching job. And now we're sort of back to the same feeling that it's been for way too long there. Kind of like the last years of Pete Carroll, right? Where you've got this coach from the outside, you could say he almost never has a losing record. But in the market, you haven't been really contending. Even when you win these 10 games, you can't even win a playoff game. And they feel like the same old high floor, low ceiling Steelers right now. So there's huge upside for them if they were to win the game. And it's against a division team that they split with this year and that they've won 2 of the last 3 games against when Lamar Jackson was the starting quarterback for Baltimore. They have a formula for beating this team. So there is a chance they could win. I don't like their chance by the way they're playing, but there's a lot at stake there. And then from a Ravens standpoint, who has more to lose in the first round than really Lamar? He because he's been such a great force and such a good player who just almost like Peyton Manning and early in his career, like just hasn't been able to really do it in the playoffs. So, if we go another year with an MVP type season from him and it just turns into nothing, I think that's a super volatile thing too. Then you have the future of Russell Wilson on the Seattle side or on the Pittsburgh side. I just think that's interesting. Division game. You're better if you're the Ravens, but they know you.
Yeah.
And we know that Lamar's production in and out of the division, that's just a natural thing that it's not oftentimes not as good in the division with the teams that know how to defend a special player.
Yeah.
So, it's probably a Ravens win. They're favored by a lot, but it just would make me a little nervous from their standpoint.
Yeah, the Russell Wilson subplot to that as well has just been fascinating. That guy went from Pittsburgh fans really being skeptical of him being inserted into the lineup when Justin Fields had done okay. I think they were 4-2 at the time when they brought him in, to then like saying, of course, like, look at what he's done. He's been great. He's a difference maker. He's certainly going to be re-signed, to now again, where everyone's like, I don't know about this guy. Let's assume that they lose, because I think very likely they lose. What do you think the chances are that Russell Wilson's back with Pittsburgh next year?
I mean, I wouldn't think it's more than 50%, would you?
I don't know. I honestly don't know, because the thing with Pittsburgh, the question then becomes, okay, then who? I don't know that they're enamored with Justin Fields either, or that the results would be different with Justin Fields.
No, that's why people are like, hey, could Aaron Rodgers go there? You know, there's all kinds of speculation about what they could possibly do. Like, to me, it matters how it ends. Like, if it's another one of these games where Russell has a demonstrably bad game, I mean, are they going to bring him back as the primary starter next year? That seems like it would be.
His persona also has just never been a clear fit with the Steelers persona. And so, like, when they're winning, he seemed like, a big play guy. He fits in a run-centric offense. Like, the style of play makes sense. He's a good fit with their, deep receiver players. But
you see his limitations over a long period of time, over a full season, don't you?
Yeah.
I think that's shown up.
I'm going to bring this up, and it'll bleed into, we're going to talk about the Seahawks offensive coordinator position here and opening in a second here. But I did a show yesterday, Mike, where I looked at not just offensive coordinator candidates for the Seahawks, but who their relationships are with quarterbacks that might be in the league. If for example, the Geno Smith situation actually is more tenuous than people expect, and that he might not be back, would the offensive coordinator potentially want to bring with him a Tavares Jackson-like bridge quarterback until they're ready to draft their next guy, assuming that Sam Howell's just not going to be handed the keys to the car? And so I looked a little bit at some of the unrestricted free agent quarterbacks for next year.
Sorry you had to do that, because I've seen that list.
I'm sure you have. Like, let's set aside Sam Darnold. I think we have a good idea what's going to happen there. But there's this has been the year you've written about it, Mike, of the kind of the resurgent set aside quarterbacks, the Baker Mayfields, the Sam Darnolds, and so forth. Well, in this class, there's some guys, like, someone's going to fall in love with some of these guys. Like Zach Wilson, top 5 pick. Is someone going to decide he can do it? Trey Lance, like, run pass, like, is he going to get someone super excited? Marcus Mariota has had, like, decent results for the Commanders. Like, you've got Drew Lock, who John Schneider already likes. Obviously, Justin Fields, Mac Jones, Jimmy Garoppolo. Like, there's a number of names in there. I'd even throw Mason Rudolph on that list. Like, none of these guys get you excited based off anything that they've done. But is someone going to look and say, we can fix this guy?
Yes, somebody could. Somebody could do that. You could decide you wanted to bring him in. I mean,
the faintest praise ever.
It's just, with the Seahawks, I don't know how you look at, their team right now and feel like Geno Smith was really holding them back. So I guess you could get some of those other guys cheaper for a year.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
But then you really are tying it to some coordinator who likes some guy or thinks he can get something out of some guy, and hey, maybe he can. More power to him if he can. But I don't know if those names excite me.
They shouldn't. They don't excite me. I will just, like, what comes back to me, Mike, is I do think history repeats itself sometimes, and humans like patterns. John Schneider, his first year, they had Matt Hasselbeck, 35-year-old season. They win a division. They win a playoff game. He has some injury issues. He throws a lot of interceptions that year. And then they fired their OC. And they're like, we literally heard from Matt Hasselbeck this week that he was told by John Schneider and Pete Carroll that if we're ever going to do it, we should do it when we're bringing in a new OC. So we're moving on. And then they don't go for the guy that's going to be their future franchise. They go out and they find a 1-year, maybe a 2-year stopgap in Tavares Jackson. And is there a chance that in John Schneider's head, he's sitting there thinking, yeah, that worked before. Why don't we jettison this guy, this 34th, going to be 35-year-old guy, throwing a lot of interceptions, get the new OC with a kind of stopgap year, and then we'll really find our quarterback in 2026.
I think they perceive themselves to be closer to contending right now than they did in 2010, right? Or
yes, I think that's right.
So they felt like they were probably disappointed to win only 10 games this year, right?
I think that's fair.
Whereas going into the season, I think that's about what I didn't think they'd probably win more than that, but they did. They liked their roster. So are you know, that gets into then what do they think the runway is here? Are we having a couple of years where we're messing around and trying to find somebody? I think they need to keep looking for sure. And they did it a little bit by bringing in Howell, but then we get to the question of, is there somebody in this draft that John Schneider falls in love with? Because he has now the clearest path he's ever had to actually draft that guy. We know that he took Russell Wilson, but he wanted to take Andy Dalton too. Before that, that was somebody he liked, right, in that draft. But they didn't take because of whatever reason. I think they took the offensive lineman. Remember, they had an empowered offensive line. They had an offensive line coach, right? They had the offensive line coach was influential with Pete Carroll, right? Was it Tom Cable?
Tom Cable, yeah.
Who it was. So they went in a different direction. Well, that type of dynamic isn't the same now. If there's a quarterback that John Schneider likes in any year, he can take them. So that could be a part of what informs this too. Is there somebody he's looking at in this draft and goes, shoot, between rounds 2 and 4, there's 2 guys I love. I'm confident we can get one of them. That could influence then what you would want to do with Geno, or what you'd want to do in trusting your coordinator with somebody that he likes, right? When you're not just totally relying on him because you have there's going to be another sort of shoe that falls, so to speak, right? There's going to be another piece to this puzzle that makes sense to you as an organization that doesn't make sense to you and me sitting here right now, right?
Yeah.
Me sitting here right now is like, why would you want to do that?
Yeah.
Well, you got to have somebody else that you really like and trust your instincts on, which Schneider could, because he actually studies the college quarterbacks and has strong opinions on them and has a record of some guys that he liked that did pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah. We're talking to Mike Sando of The Athletic, as we do every Friday and throughout the season. And the Geno thing will move off for now. I will just say it has become very clear to me that he is just much more polarizing among Seahawks fans than almost any quarterback that they've had for a long time. Matt Hasselbeck was a guy that was generally loved. Yeah. There were a lot of Seahawks fans that were happy to see him go. I was not one of them. I think Matt Hasselbeck for me is probably still my favorite Seahawk of all time to cheer for as a person and a player. But in any event, I do think that there is not Geno is not beloved the way a lot of players that you're asking ownership to pay big money to.
And that's because of the red zone stuff. I mean, I'd love to know what was going through John Schneider's mind on those red zone plays. Because that might be some of the answer to our question is the thinking, what are we doing down there with this play call? Or is it, what is Geno doing down there? He's costing us the game, and we know, I think part of the answer to that has been answered by the fact that they're going to have a different OC. But I would love to know, how that was viewed, because those plays were so bad.
They were very bad.
They're
explainable in some ways, but they were, you can't have that many of those situations and have it always be circumstantial.
Absolutely.
At some point, the quarterback has to take some accountability for the decisions that are getting made there and the circumstances.
And if I'm a fan sitting in the stands every week, because remember, I'm not. I got all the games on. If the Seahawks win or lose, it doesn't affect me the way it would if I was a fan. Those plays could definitely be polarizing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Mike, you and I talked about this. We've been talking about it for a lot of the season. I brought it up to you where I thought there was a philosophical divide between Ryan Grubb and Mike McDonald. And we talked about,
Yep.
you brought up, there isn't like this prior relationship that would keep that no matter what they could build off of. And so lo and behold, Monday after their final game, they make the call to let Ryan Grubb go and start their offensive coordinator search. What did you make of that move when you heard it happen?
It was expected for me, as we talked about. There was really only one game, I think, which was the game at Arizona, where it felt like everything came together in the way that they wanted it to be. Mm-hmm. It just felt like, they were never on the same page. And while McDonald was respectful of Grubb, including in that final week comments that we talked about, where he made it almost contextualized the issues as being, hey, it's the first time in the NFL, made it seem a little more understandable. I didn't really buy that meant that he wanted to sign up for it again another year. I think it was a disappointing year for the Seahawks at that OC position. And so to me, the change was not surprising at all. Now, the fact they did it right away, even put an exclamation point on it, right? They weren't even considering their options first. They were going to move on. So not a surprise. I think it's probably the best thing. And now this coach will be more on the hook for the next one. Because I do think this first one was a little bit more of a team effort. Mike McDonald was hired late in the process. He's a young coach. He probably was unable to get who he wanted or didn't have, somebody that he was super strong on. I sort of give him a little bit of a pass for this first one and now want to see, okay, you have a chance now. You thought about it all year. You got to get somebody who, and not mess this one up. This has to be somebody that you're accountable for.
Yes. That is the big difference. There's no more explainable issues here. You've got to nail this hire. And I think they're in a decent position to do that relative to, if, as Mike McDonald said, being able to, one of the benefits of being out of the playoffs is you get to start right away. You get a jump start on all the teams that were in the playoffs by looking for this, and not all the teams that have gone out of the playoffs have searches to be done, although a lot of them do. You mentioned kind of Mike McDonald's words about Ryan Grubb before the last game. Geno Smith had some really strong words for Ryan Grubb after the last game.
After he made $6 million on incentives?
It kind of, the way it came across to me with the Mike McDonald thing was, I want to be classy to this guy going out, and this is not about that I don't think he's a good coach, but this just wasn't going to work. So I'm going to, as his manager now, as his boss, I want to put out good things about him. And I would bet you that Mike McDonald would be a reference if people ask. Not that I think Ryan Grubb's going to ask for it, but the Geno Smith thing's interesting. Do you think that there is anything there about his own status on the team that you think might have been intertwined with wanting Ryan Grubb to come back?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I think he was probably, genuinely liked him, and they probably had a good relationship. But I don't think it would be a lot more than that. I didn't read too much into what he said about him as that he's incredibly disappointed that he's not there, or anything like that, or that he's tied to him in any way. I think, they need a different offensive philosophy, which will benefit Geno too. I mean, Geno was really under a lot of duress this year playing that style behind that line. And I think altering some of how they play could actually help him. In addition to, of course, they have to help the line.
Well, so now we're in this situation where the Seahawks are looking for a new offensive coordinator. And for people that don't know this, I think it's important to kind of set the rules. We've got 3 names that have been released, and the immediate assumption is, so these are like the leaders in the clubhouse for the job. Mike, as I understand it, the way the rules work now, and they keep changing, so correct me if I'm
Yeah.
wrong here, but the wild card round, you can't interview these guys until after the game, and even if they win, you can only do a virtual interview, and it has to be, I think, 2 days following the game that they play. For teams that lose, you can request to actually do an in-person interview. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that sounds right. You're right. It does change, but that sounds right.
So the fact that we've got these three names that we're about to talk about does not mean that these are their first choices. It means that the Lions are on a bye week, so you're able to interview someone from their staff now. You've got Thomas Brown, who we'll talk about. Bears are not in the playoffs, and you've got Klint Kubiak, and the Saints are not in the playoffs. So that's part of why these names are the first names to come up. When you heard the three names, Hank Fraley, the offensive line coach for the Lions, Thomas Brown, the interim head coach for the Bears, and Klint Kubiak, the OC for the Saints, what were your initial reactions to each of those names?
Klint Kubiak would be the guy, in my opinion, would be the guy. And then the other ones, I don't know if it would, as you put together a staff, you could have a pass game coordinator, you could have a run game coordinator. Those, obviously Hank Fraley's on the Lions, so I don't think he's not going to be leaving for like a lateral move. But Thomas Brown could be available for any capacity, right?
Mm-hmm.
To me, Kubiak, I've been pretty impressed by him. Obviously that the lineage of Kubiak, right? Probably what you're getting, and I think that's exactly the type of coordinator that a Mike McDonald would want, because that your offense is going to be rooted in a run game by the scheme.
I'm interested, I don't know enough about Klint versus Clay. Obviously, Klint Kubiak is the OC for the 49ers. He does not have play calling responsibility. But Klint he was an OC at the Saints. He's been an OC previously at the Vikings, I believe. When I looked back at those teams, I have not seen something that was particularly impressive. And one of the things, like their dad, was known for being an under-center, play action kind of coordinator. Like that was kind of his game with the Broncos. Wherever he went, that was what he brought with him. And Klint Kubiak for the Saints, all the Ks, man, too many Ks. They were 23rd in the NFL with the Saints last year in play action rate. The Seahawks are 29th, which I think is an issue, but he was not a heavy play action guy. I went back to the Vikings. He was not a super heavy play action guy. So I'm curious, is it just the lineage with his father, or is there something else that's kind of caught your attention that makes him an interesting candidate?
Well, when he first went to the Saints, they set like some records for scoring in the first couple of games, didn't they?
They did.
And then everything just sort of fell apart as their offensive line fell apart, and then pretty soon Carr was hurt, and all of that. I have generally heard good things about him just from people that have been on staffs or been on teams with him. And then I do, obviously the last name is probably carrying a lot of that just because of the good feel you would have for a Gary Kubiak, right, with his offense. So, yeah, that stuff bears investigating and asking about what he wanted to do, why he did or didn't do certain things. But I would feel like you're going to get something a little bit closer to maybe what a Kyle Shanahan would do than by hiring the other people that you mentioned.
Yeah, and when of all the names, I think Hank Fraley was probably the most surprising.
Sure.
And one of the things that was surprising about that, Mike, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of offensive line coaches that go on to be offensive coordinators. And you and I were kind of talking about this a little bit. There are some pretty prominent examples that maybe people don't realize.
Oh, yeah, there are. I mean, I think, Andy Reid came up in that world of offensive line play, was an offensive lineman himself, and counter to what you might think, before he became head coach, had not been a play caller. Arthur Smith is somebody who has background in offensive line. Matt Rule, Doug Marrone, Frank Smith, I think, who's with the Dolphins now, Joe Philbin, Mike Munchak, Tom Cable, Bill Callahan. I think all these guys have called offense. I think Pat Shurmur has some rooting in offensive line. But as a general rule, that's not where teams go to look for their offensive coordinators, because a general perception is that those guys are much more involved in the run game than the pass game, and the league is primarily a passing league. So that's why, you generally don't see, running back coaches, to be named as offensive coordinator either, because the pass game is so intricate to it. On the other side of the ball, a lot of times, you're looking for a coordinator who has defensive backfield experience because of the pass game, the importance of defending the pass, right? So that's what I would want to have answered. If you did get somebody who was primarily known for offensive line play, what's their exposure been to the pass game? Have they been a tight ends coach, which gets you kind of a foot in each world, right? So somebody like, I believe like a Kevin Stefanski might have coached tight ends or been involved in that. I'd have to check that. But that type of stuff becomes interesting to me. And then who would be his pass game coordinator, or how would that work, right? What are you actually going to get? Because for the most part, these coordinators are hired on the passing game side. Maybe they were a pass game coordinator, and then they rely on the Hank Fraleys of the world for their run game. And that becomes their most important hire. But you still generally want to have the pass intricacies guy be your coordinator. That's the way it's been in the league going back a long time. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're getting this guy. Are you getting only a run game guy, right?
I loved the interaction with two of my favorite guests on the show, both from The Athletic. Robert Mays quote tweeted yesterday the Hank Fraley news, saying this is a hilarious overreaction to what happened with the Seahawks, and I'm all for it. And I think somewhere down the line you responded, made me laugh, saying they should hire a run game coordinator and have Hank Fraley be the the assistant to him.
They should hire somebody even more run-oriented than Fraley and make Fraley the pass game coordinator,
Yes,
right? It's like, remember that year when Pete Carroll just decided they were going to be overly run the ball, whatever the year that was, when they went to like barely passing at all. Like he just had this visceral reaction to, we lost our way and we were throwing it too much. And the next year, they just went completely overboard. They were the most run-oriented team since the Tim Tebow Broncos on early downs, early in the game. It was unbelievable. It was like it became a problem. Like that's where the let Russ cook stuff came from, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah. That was definitely a part of it.
So,
and I mean, I think the Fraley thing's interesting in that. What's the biggest thing the Seahawks need to do to be a contending football team from a roster perspective, from a personnel perspective?
Line of scrimmage.
100%, right? No question. Anybody you'd ask that's watched a second of Seahawks football would tell you that the offensive line is where they need to go. And if you look at the Lions, you could say when you look at the Lions offensive line, it's the class of the league. And then you say, well, yeah, but they're talking about a Penei Sewell at number 7 overall, and you're talking about all these top picks that they've acquired. But it did involve them drafting Frank Ragnow, a center, at 20. That's not normal. And it did involve them getting Kevin Zeitler there this year, who the Seahawks have tried to get multiple times. Yeah. And you do wonder, Kevin Zeitler is a free agent this year again. Dan Skipper will be a free agent this year. If you bring somebody in, you and I have talked about when we've said John Schneider's had this blind spot around offensive line talent, and you've brought up time and again, Mike. Yeah, but that's a position group that's heavily influenced by the coach, the offensive line coach, in terms of who you get and who they want in the room. That's got to be one really big feather in the cap of Hank Fraley as a candidate.
It is, but you're either committed to your line or you're not. To me, and look at look what the Chiefs did when they lost the Super Bowl to Tampa Bay, and Patrick Mahomes was overrun by that defense of the Bucs.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they said, you know what? We're going to go get or Joe Tooney or maybe Orlando Brown. I mean, they did. They drafted Creed Humphrey, Trey Smith, right?
Trey Smith, who will be an unrestricted free agent shortly.
Yeah, and so you look at some of these teams like this year. Detroit was like, we got caught shorthanded in our secondary, so they like traded for a guy from the Bucs. They used draft picks, multiple high draft picks, like addressing a problem, right? I think if you're a Seahawk fan or a watcher of this team, just one time, would you like to have that? Just like, hey, you know what? This is our issue, and hell or high water, no one's going to say we didn't address it.
Yeah, I think no matter what, that's the case. And I think part of what I'm bringing up there is it matters who you are adding and who's helping you to make those calls.
Sure.
And also having a voice in the room that's like, well, I don't know, maybe these guys are overdrafted and overpaid. I don't know if I want to spend. Having someone like Hank Fraley say, no, Trey Smith's worth every penny. Let's go get that guy.
Yeah.
It's okay to use the 18th pick on this guy. I think matters.
And it's getting the tone setter guys too. It's Frank Ragnow. What he brings to the table is more than just being a good center.
Yes.
And we saw this in the great Seattle lines. Robbie Tobeck, sorry, Robbie, but I mean, he wasn't an all-pro every year. But, when somebody hit Matt Hasselbeck late, he was the first guy in their face, right? And they had an identity on the offensive line that came from him and how he worked and how he interacted with everybody and how he brought everybody together. The Seahawks center this year was signed in August and retired in the season. So do you think that's a little bit of a difference?
It's a little bit of a difference.
Then Robbie Tobeck in there or those types of guys? You need to get some guys that it's not just somebody who is the highest graded center or something. It's like have some identity there. I think Abe Lucas gave him some of that.
I think that's right. I think that's also, I think the offensive line coach or the person who's setting the tone for that room also matters. I think people still underestimate, like Tom Cable is mostly a dislike figure here in Seattle, which I think is, I understand, but I actually think is wrong because I think people misunderstand how instrumental Tom Cable was in the Seahawks winning a Super Bowl. And it was Tom Cable who was able to finally get breakthrough with Marshawn Lynch to say, no, you cannot freelance this run. You've got to hit it in this gap, in this way, at this time. That's the way this is designed to work. And their run game completely changed in the back half of 2011 because he was able to get through. And quite honestly, Mike, someone needs to have that conversation with Kenneth Walker as well. And you have to have somebody who has the credibility and the certainty and the confidence to do that. And I think Hank Fraley seems like that guy. I don't know if you heard what Taylor Decker said about Hank Fraley when Dan Campbell took the job, but I'm going to read you this quote for people that haven't heard it. He says, "One thing I flat out asked for was to give Hank an opportunity to interview for the job. Don't just clean house because I think he does a really great job. I think he has a really great understanding of the game, studies the hell out of everything and all the defenses, and I think his approach with delivering information and new techniques is fantastic because he played the game for 11 years. By the way, he was a center. He's good for the room, a lot of young guys in the room, and I think he's done a really good job." From a culture setting, which, by the way, I think is something Mike McDonald could use some help on, from a working with young offensive linemen, from understanding how to communicate information and how to make sure people understand how this fits together. Those are some pretty powerful advantages or strengths for any coach to bring in.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Bringing an identity to that group. It's such a team-oriented group, and the pride they take in how they play, how they finish, and an accountability to that. a standard, right? Those are all things that can be controlled like through your coach, and the effort that you're giving. So I do come back to that center position. I just think when John Schneider was in Green Bay, they had Frank Winters. Just Ragnow, right? I mentioned Tobeck. Like, I think there's something to that. There's something to that, having a leader up front that is a reflection of the line coach, right? They embody the same things. I think gives you a lot. So, yes, that line coach position is really, really important. I don't know that I want to hire a line coach for my coordinator.
Yeah.
But I definitely want to have a really good one. Look at the Eagles have great talent on their offensive line, but Jeff Stoutland, is known as a really good line coach there. And so I do think it can make a big difference.
Well, there's a couple other names that we haven't heard yet, probably because they're playing. But Adam Stenavich for the Packers is the offensive line background. He's their OC, and a lot of people think he'll be a name to look for. And then Frank Smith, who has an offensive line background and is the OC for the Dolphins. He interviewed with the Seahawks last year. So there are a few other potential candidates that could come from that background. The difference being that they now have had OC positions, even if they don't have play calling responsibilities, which is different than going straight from being an offensive line coach to being an OC.
So the distinction between those guys is that Frank Smith has a number of years where he was coaching tight ends. I think he's got 3 years with the Bears, 2 with the Raiders, 3 with the Raiders as tight ends. So to me, that puts your foot in a little bit more of the passing game than Stenavich, who I believe has just been offensive line oriented, right? As when he's coached a position. So that could be something to keep in mind when looking at these candidates too.
Yeah. Well, I would say this, Mike. I don't think, as much as Robert May's tweet was very funny, I don't think it's possible to overcorrect on the offensive line for the Seahawks. They could make a massive leap forward in focus on that position group, and they'd still not be necessarily too even, given where they've been for so many years. So it will be fascinating to see what happens there. When we turn our attention to some of the other candidates, we talked about Kubiak, we've talked about Hank Fraley. What about Thomas Brown? I mean, this is a guy who, despite you look at his 2 stints as an OC and you say, I mean, the Panthers last year and the Bears this year, no, thank you. But this is a guy that Sean McVay brought into the league. He elevated him to assistant head coach 1 year later. Then you've got Frank Reich, who's, given him a chance as OC. You've got some pretty prominent, smart offensive coaches who have liked what he has to offer. So what do you think it is about Thomas Brown that's got people's attention and given him these chances so far?
I think he's very impressive in a one-on-one situation when you talk to him. I think he makes a really good impression, comes across as really capable, smart. So I think that helps him. Now, he is rooted as a running back coach. So I would want to make sure that he's ready to handle, the whole room. And I don't know that we have evidence to that effect that it's gone well, right? And he was with Sean McVay. I don't know. I guess Sean McVay made him assistant head coach / running backs, but that's not really putting you up the ladder too much, right? He wasn't, going up to be. He wasn't, coaching the quarterbacks or necessarily in a coordinator type position. Now he was with the Panthers, but under an offensive coach in Frank Reich, who did all that and then took over on an interim basis and didn't move the needle, and then took over on an interim basis with the Bears and had a nice couple of games that looked a little bit better. But, can you, what evidence is there what track record is there that this would be a high odds successful coordinator hire? That has to be answered in the interview, because I don't think it's on the resume.
Yeah. That's That's kind of my feel for this one. It doesn't seem as likely. But tell me this, Mike. I mean, when I was doing my past life job in tech, there'd be companies. We'd actually talk to companies that wanted to be acquired or had, or we'd be looking in a specific place that we were interested in acquiring a technology or a company, and we would talk to companies that we really didn't have a strong intent to acquire because we wanted to learn. It was amazing what company, what folks would tell you in these situations about how their company works, where they succeed, what doesn't work. And you just learn a ton from talking to people and listening. How much do you think that goes on in these interview processes where it's an opportunity to talk to people across the league and like learn about how they see this particular system or exposure to that, or maybe learn about, you've worked with this person, what did you find in that situation?
Oh, totally. Yeah.
How much of that goes on with some of the people that get brought in for
I think it's a lot of it. It's a part of all of them, because you are trying to put together sort of a dossier on people, and you want to have good relationships with them. You want to get to know them. Maybe you're going to bring in somebody that you could see being your coordinator 2 years from now, or that you want to know. Maybe you think Mike Kafka is a potential head coach down the line, and who knows, maybe you would consider him for that, or right. So you could bring him in, even if you weren't sure you could get him, or you weren't sure the role was right for him now. I think that's a part of just smart interviewing. If you're like last year in the process of going through to get Mike McDonald, the Seahawks, talk to Raheem Morris, right? Or talk to a number of candidates. I think all of those had value beyond whether we were going to hire him for just the connection. Now, when John Schneider, he may have known Raheem Morris before, but I'm just use that as an example. At the league meetings this year in the spring, when all the families are together, maybe there's a bunch of time spent with Raheem and John get together, and then who knows what happens. Maybe there's a coach on Raheem's staff who, the Seahawks might be considering, and maybe then they can have a more honest conversation about that person 2 years from now, right? Because they've gone through the interview process, built some trust, had a couple more reps at league events. I think all of that stuff is valuable.
So help me remember on this, Mike. The rules state when you're looking to interview somebody that if they have play calling duties, then you can't interview them, or you can't. The team has to allow that. They can block that. If they don't have play calling responsibilities, then you cannot block for an OC position. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
So one of the things that's, came out as well, Mike Garofalo reported that last year the Giants blocked the Seahawks from interviewing Mike Kafka. They had interviewed him for the head coach position, but then when they wanted to interview him for the OC position, the Giants blocked him from being available to do that. And his play calling responsibilities are kind of messy. Like he had them
wasn't
taken
calling
away
this year.
Yeah.
I don't even think he was involved in it this year.
So it's interesting to me, like, how does that play in the NFL? Like, first of all, I'm not going to ask you for the specific rules about like why that is or isn't allowed. If you know, that would be great. But Pete Carroll made a real point of saying he would never stand in the way of his assistants going to take jobs that they were wanting to take. And that he learned that early on in his career, that he was blocked and didn't appreciate it. And so he never wanted to stand in the way. If you've got a person, I mean, this also goes back to my experience. If you've got a person that wants to leave, holding them hostage generally is not going to result in the best thing. So talk me through like what the thought process is there.
Well, so I look at the Giants last off season was a real tenuous one, or kind of a tumultuous one for Brian Daboll, the coach of the Giants. Remember, Wink Martindale was the D coordinator. He was leaving in a huff, and there was reports that they FU'd to each other and the send off, and then it was really acrimonious. And there was a lot of stories about Daboll's temper and temperament, and people on the staff borderline mutiny, didn't want to be there, that sort of a thing. So I think it was a sensitive time for them to have even more people leaving the staff, even if some of the guys didn't want to be there or maybe wanted to pursue opportunities elsewhere. That's just my read on it from afar of like, why would they
Mm-hmm.
block Kafka?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think they largely removed Kafka from the play calling infrastructure this year to where I think it was all day ball. So then I wondered, okay, would they be more willing to let Kafka leave this offseason? Because it sort of died down around the Giants. There's a lot of scrutiny on Joe Shane, the GM, for all the moves there. There's some scrutiny on Daboll as a third-year coach, but I feel like the heat went off Daboll a little bit in terms of you don't feel like it's out of control there, right?
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't like out of control. There's not a lot of stories coming out about discord on the staff. So would it be easier now to let somebody leave if they wanted to? I think it would be. Now, I don't know where that's at. I don't know what Daboll is thinking. But I would sure think that Mike Kafka would want to go somewhere else to have a different opportunity, because I don't think the Giants situation is what he probably signed up for when he went there at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting to me, we're talking to Mike Sando of The Athletic, that Mike Kafka is getting head coaching interviews, like multiple head coaching interviews. And
he has a good reputation.
So talk to me. How does that happen when you've never actually done it? You've never done, like, he's never really been an OC even. He doesn't have an accomplishment to point to. How do you go from that to getting head coach interviews?
Well, he was with Andy Reid, correct?
He was with, that's the thing, is he's associated with Andy Reid.
So he is seen as a real up and comer because he's only 37 years old. So he's somebody who played quarterback in the league, but wasn't a star, right? So he's kind of had to be a grinder. I think he was a mid-round pick when he came in, and then has had, a good run. I has had good exposure to Andy Reid, and we've seen Matt Nagy get a head coaching job. And as much as it was seen as a failure in Chicago, I don't think his record was that bad. I'd have to look. Maybe it was at the end, but I think he, they did okay. And I think Kafka has just the word has gotten out. Hey, this is somebody to look at. And then I think he's made positive impressions when he's had those interviews. So that's all that is. I think people are differentiated. People look at the Giants situation and they're not blaming him.
Mm-hmm. The guy that has some similar pedigree, but without the exposure to like an Andy Reid type, former quarterback, seems smart. I think had a really good reputation as a player, even though he wasn't that great of a quarterback. Josh McCown is a guy that has, I think he has been a quarterback's coach the last couple of years this year in Minnesota. And some people are thinking he's part of what's going on with Sam Darnold. He's getting interviews and requests as well. They're all having to wait until after this week. What's your thought there? I mean, I always admired him as a player. Very tough guy. Seemed very smart.
I don't know how smart he was running some of those runs and getting helicoptered around. I'm joking. I would say that to him.
He was tough.
But yes, yeah. So remember, he was supposedly in running to become the Texans head coach when he was hadn't even been a coach before. Remember that? Mm-hmm. And they were doing weird stuff. They had they had that New England guy who was there. What was his name? Jack Easterby. They were doing some odd stuff, and then his name came up and was kind of floated, and then I think they ended up doing, is that when they did the David Coley year? They did or they did something else. They sort of just bowed out and almost didn't hire a coach. They just sort of did a default, and then McCown then kind of, I think he went to Carolina, and that obviously wasn't a good experience, and now he's on the opposite end of that with Minnesota. So I think people are intrigued by him, kind of a little bit the same way of Kafka, somebody who played the position, wasn't a star, stuck with it a long time, comes across positively when you talk to them. You kind of like them. They project the idea that they know what they're talking about. When you talk to them. So, and now you have a successful time with Minnesota. I think he's one of those guys who's been on people's list as, hey, could he grow into something?
What do you think about Doug Pederson? Obviously let go as the Jags coach, and he'd kind of given up play calling duties to Press Taylor, and that didn't go well. One, what are your thoughts about Doug Pederson in general? Two, do you think he's someone that could be a potential OC candidate for the Seahawks?
I was just not impressed at all with Jacksonville, with him in Jacksonville. Why wouldn't you call the plays? What did they bring you there for? With everything on the line, with Trevor Lawrence, you didn't have an itch to do it because you have Press Taylor? Nothing against Press Taylor. I'm sure he worked at it and all of that. But, can you imagine an offensive guy? Can you imagine Mike Holmgren being like, Gil, Haskell, you just call it. I mean, I know, time's running out here, and we've got this franchise quarterback. I want to see some initiative. Take control of this thing and live or die with it. And then whenever I watched Doug Pederson's press conferences, I was like, he never had answers. It's like he hadn't even thought about some of these things. So he seemed disengaged to me.
That's the word that comes to mind to me as well.
I just I can almost in my mind everyone's wondering, why did they stick with Trent Baalke? And it's like, well, maybe they do have some decent players there, and they just weren't getting anything out of them by the offensive play calling head coach who refused to call the plays.
Yeah.
And couldn't fix the offense. And by the way, what did they do last offseason? They fired their defensive coordinator who had a top 10 defense and got way worse on defense. So that may be a place. I don't think, Trevor Lawrence is all that, but that's the type of place where somebody could go in and probably win 10 games to me. And I just feel like Doug Pederson, for whatever reason, just wasn't bringing it. And would he as an offensive coordinator? I don't know. This stage.
Mike, I would just say I think those uniforms will hold any coach back from being too enthusiastic. I mean, they've had so many opportunities to change those uniforms, and they just won't
watched
do it.
The press conferences though, and I'm like, it just wasn't as engaged as I want the coach to be. I want this guy to be on it.
Yeah.
You asked Mike McDonald about something, you can tell he's thought about it.
Yes.
I just didn't feel when I watched the Jaguar stuff, I'm like, had he really thought about this? Is he into this?
Is there anybody that when you heard the Seahawks are going to have this position open, is there anybody that kind of came to mind for you as I wonder if they're going to go this direction?
No, not yet. But that's just because I'm going to be honest. I'm a Doug Pederson here. I haven't thought about it enough to do that. Just with all of the other stuff that I'm doing, I haven't drilled down on it yet. How about you? You're obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of the interesting names. I think Mike LaFleur is an interesting name with the Rams. The other Kubiak down in San Francisco is interesting. I think anyone connected with Jim Harbaugh and some of that's interesting. So a name that people bring up that I just don't see is David Shaw, who obviously was an offensive coordinator for Harbaugh back in Stanford, and then the Stanford head coach, and he's doing personnel exec work for the Broncos. That feels like a stretch to me. I don't see it.
Something seems off with him a little bit too. I don't know what it is.
He's never wanted to be an NFL coach. He had many opportunities and always said no to it. So I don't know. I'm not sure I see that. So no, I'm curious about it. Obviously the Stenovich thing. Yeah.
LaFleur's an interesting name. I think LaFleur's an interesting name to watch.
Personally, I've been super impressed by Matt LaFleur in general, and that's part of what has me interested in Stenovich as an offshoot of that. And then Mike LaFleur, though, I mean, how much of his time in New York that went so poorly is a Zach Wilson-related issue? And at the same time, how much did he sign off on Zach Wilson as a top pick? And is that an indicator that he's got some issues there.
I wouldn't read too much into that. I would doubt that. I'm sure he was excited to work with. Shoot, people are talking about Zach Wilson this offseason. Like, hey, is he going to go to a better place? It's like that classic picture showing Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold in Panthers uniforms. And now this year they're both having good years. So I wouldn't hold anything that happened to the Jets against a coach who wasn't even the head coach, right?
Yes.
So I think I've heard pretty good things in general about him. So that would be a really intriguing one to me.
Yeah. The only other thing I'll say, and then obviously we got to let you go. It was very interesting that Mike McDonald said not currently looking at internal candidates, which meant Jake Peetz, who was a passing game coordinator last year, who they kind of wrestled away from Sean McVay, is not a candidate at this point. They haven't let him go. So maybe he could be married with a run game coordinator, and we'll see how that could work. But that was news to me, because I thought he would be the one thing that Mike McDonald is not going to be able to do is go out and find someone who he spent a bunch of time with and has a bunch of. That's not the only person he could do that with is Jake Peetz, who he's now had a full year as head coach working closely with.
So Jake Peetz would have been with Thomas Brown maybe for a year or two at the Rams. Would he have also overlapped LaFleur?
He may have.
So there's all those connections. I don't know what they're thinking with internal candidates on the staff. I would have thought maybe he would have been considered too, and maybe, who knows, maybe he would stay, depending on who the next coach is, and maybe his value is in a different place for McDonald. I don't know where that's at.
All right, last question for you, Mike. And we don't usually get into prognostication stuff with you, so I don't know if you're looking at any of these games this way, but of any of the games this weekend or this week in general, are there any ones where you think the underdog is likely to win? And if you need me to, I will go through and tell you.
No, I've got the games here. I mean, to me, Minnesota's an obvious. Oh no, Minnesota's favored.
Their favorite.
The Rams. I'd say the Rams is an underdog. Yep.
Interesting.
I think some of the things that Brian Flores does that can really throw off a quarterback may throw off Matt Stafford less than others. Like, I think Matt Stafford can process and handle some of the stuff thrown their way. So that would be one where, like, I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Rams won that game. I would not be. I still would not be overly shocked if Pittsburgh did. I'd be a little surprised. I would not be overly shocked. I mean, I'm going to say the Rams is my choice, but like Green Bay to me could lose by 30 or win the game. Like, I think they're a volatile team.
Yes.
That could do anything. You just don't.
Green Bay's mine. Green Bay's my sneaky underdog. We'll see. I have some questions about the Eagles, but we will see.
I do. I have some questions about them too. I just have questions about Green Bay. So I think
really
the games
quickly,
are interesting. Yeah.
Just news. All-Pro team, AP All-Pro team just came out. No Seahawk made either the first or the second team. So Leonard Williams, no Pro Bowl, no All-Pro, despite 11 sacks.
Yeah. So I am a voter for that. I did vote for him I did do an All-Pro vote for him. I thought he was outstanding.
Thank you for saying that. It's good to know that somebody did.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought he was great. I thought he took over games. So
he did. He did. He should have been on this list, but you know what? Next year, we'll see what happens.
So we don't. Just the All-Pro team came out, right? The award stuff comes out later. So
correct.
Is it All-Pro first and second teams came out?
First and second team is out. The people that were first team defensive tackles were Cam Hayward and Chris Jones. Second team defensive tackles Zach Allen and Jalen Carter.
Okay. Yeah, Jalen Carter's good too.
Yeah,
those are fine.
I don't want to shock you. There's no Seahawks offensive lineman selected for either the first or the second team All-Pro.
Snub. I think Walter Jones should be on it every year forever.
Oh, man, I wish Walter Jones was still playing. All right, Mike, I've kept you longer than ever. Thank you so much. Make sure you check out Mike Sando's Pick 6 column. It comes every week, and he does an amazing job with it. It's like 6 articles in one. So check that out. Mike, have a great rest of your weekend.
You too. Thanks.
All right. That was Mike Sando of The Athletic with us every Friday. And I'm bummed. I'm bummed about the All-Pro situation. It's nice to hear that Mike put Leonard Williams on the list. I really was holding out hope that he was going to get that acknowledgement for him. I mean, it doesn't mean much to me, but it really, like seeing him, talking to him about this, getting snubbed from the Pro Bowl, it mattered to him. Not getting on the All-Pro team, I think it's going to matter to him. If there's an upside, keeps him hungry. But honestly, I mean, this is a guy that had 11 sacks, led all interior defensive linemen in sacks. If this had been almost any other player on any other team that had had this kind of production at that position, he'd be on the Pro Bowl and he'd be on the All-Pro. So I do think being in Seattle works against him in this kind of situation. And it's a shame. I mean, I think he's the only guy. I mean, you could make an argument for Devin Witherspoon, but he definitely didn't have the numbers. The cornerbacks that made it, Trent McDuffie, Christian Gonzalez, Derwin James made it as a slot corner, which is weird to me as a second team. This is second team. First team for cornerbacks, Patrick Surtain, Derek Stingley, Marlon Humphrey. It's interesting. They're naming guys as slot corners that aren't really corners. So I don't know if that's just third corner is probably the best way to title it, because Marlon Humphrey is not a slot corner. Neither is Surtain or Stingley Jr. But, at a safety position, you could kind of make a case for Julian Love, Kirby Joseph, Xavier McKinney. I think very logical there. Budda Baker, Kyle Hamilton got second team. I think that makes sense. Interesting that both of the Washington Commanders inside linebackers made second team All-Pro, Frankie Louvu and Bobby Wagner. So congrats to Bobby on doing that again. Interesting there. Other names that are kind of interesting. Nick Benito makes second team All-Pro as an edge player. Andrew Van Ginkel makes second team All-Pro as an edge player. Myles Garrett and Trey Hendrickson were first team All-Pro defensive edge players. Other names. Looking through this to see if there's other names that are interesting here. Not really. Not really. I think that's from a quarterback perspective, people are curious. Lamar Jackson makes first team All-Pro quarterback. Josh Allen is second. So we'll see where it goes from an MVP perspective. But at least from an All-Pro perspective, the voters put Lamar over Josh Allen. So we'll see if that is a precursor of what could happen there. Nasir, you're saying, what makes me think they won't keep him? Won't keep who? I'm not sure who. Maybe you're talking about someone else in chat. All right. I know I have some super chats, so let me get to these. Nasir said, good morning, Brian. Have you a chance to look into Marcus Brady? I really think he's a great fit. I just want your opinion. I haven't spent any more time on Marcus Brady, so I'm sorry to say. I know you brought him up a couple times. Has not been someone who's really grabbed my attention. I know he's a favorite of yours, but we'll spend a little bit more time, getting into some of these names as they start to surface. Obviously, he's a name that we won't really know until next week because the Chargers are still in the playoffs. They'd have to be knocked out for them to do an in-person interview. They'd have to just be 2 days past for them to get a chance to do a remote virtual interview. So we'll find out if Marcus Brady's a name we should get familiar with pretty darn soon. Hawks fan Matt Man says, what are the chances John actually ends up overcorrecting on the O-line issue? Is that even possible? Well, I think I read your mind, Matt. I don't think it's possible to overcorrect. I mean, to be very honest, I've talked to you guys about this before. I do think that simplifying it to offensive line is not really accurate because the Seahawks have invested quite a bit of capital in the tackle position, and John Schneider's had some pretty good results from the tackle position. Charles Cross, Abe Lucas being just a couple years ago, hitting on a first and a third round pick, who are two of the best tackles from that entire draft. It's not bad. So At the same time, yes, the interior part of that line is really mushy and has been, and I think that needs a massive overcorrection, needs a massive correction. Bryce Coots becomes a YouTube member. So great to have you. Thanks, Bryce. Really appreciate you. Thank you for doing it. I think Bryce has got his own show over on his own channel, so make sure you check him out as well. So here we are. I mean, I think really I've done a bunch of reading on the people from yesterday and looking through some stuff. Where I end up is I'm not sure any of the guys that we heard about yesterday are going to be the primary candidates for this team. The guy that I'm most interested in is Hank Fraley. I think he brings the most to the team. The fact that he is not a play caller is a real concern to me. And I think that projecting an offensive line coach directly to be making play calling decisions, that's a stretch for me. So as much as I love the idea, I just don't know. That one seems tough. So I think we're going to probably find out the real names next week. That's where you will get guys that are on these wild card teams that we'll hear about, that they're going to talk to, and then we'll dive into those guys. So I still think guys like Stenovich are interesting. I think guys like Frank Smith are interesting. I think guys like Mike LaFleur are interesting. It is worth mentioning that the Seahawks could have reached out to Klint Kubiak. I make sure Clay Kubiak of the 49ers, because they're not in the playoffs and they didn't. So they picked one Kubiak over the other pretty clearly. But yeah, I think we're going to find out a lot more about these true OC candidates next week. But I will say, Hank Fraley, I'm intrigued by. I like a lot of what he would bring to the team, but I'm pretty concerned about how that would work out as a play caller. All right, everybody. I will be back with you tomorrow. Hopefully, maybe Jeff Simmons will be available. He's, got a newborn, so his schedule is going to be hard to predict, but we'll see if we can make that work. Would love to get his thoughts on what's going on here. And appreciate everybody who's joined today. It's great to see you, the thousands of folks that join every day for Hawk Blogger Mornings. We're going to keep this rolling through the off season, and we've got a bunch of folks joining at patreon.com/hawkblogger. Now's a great time to join, as we're going to have continuing amazing content. So you get access to the Slack channel where there's the community, keeps the conversation going all the time. And by the way, I'm going to be going to the Senior Bowl in a few weeks. There's going to be all sorts of great content, a lot of great prospects that are going to be down there that I'm going to speak to, their agents, all sorts of stuff. A lot of that stuff will be Patreon only stuff. So patreon.com/hawkblogger is where you want to sign up. Give the show a like, click subscribe if you haven't already. And in just a little bit, I'm going to be talking to JK Boots about what we're going to do next, which means we're almost through with this initial promo. Code HawkBlogger at jkboots.com will get you 10% off. Best boots you're ever going to own. I love my JK boots. I really do. I've never been a boot guy. But when I wear these boots, I feel badass, man. I'm serious. They're heavy. They're heavy duty. You can just feel these things are made to last, and they're made with love and expertise. Over in Spokane, Washington, a family-owned company. And not only do you get 10% off, but you get a chance to be selected to get this pair of custom-made Seahawks-themed boots. And you'll be the only person on the planet that has them. All you got to do is use code HawkBlogger. No advantage to have done it earlier or later. As long as you do it before I decide who's going to get them, you're in the mix. So sign up at code with JK Boots. Use code HawkBlogger to buy a pair of boots, and you get a chance to be the one that wins these boots. So appreciate all of you tuning in and supporting the show. I will see you all later. If there's any kind of new news, we might do emergency pods, all that stuff. We did just get another new member. Mike A has become a member. Appreciate you, Mike. And have a wonderful rest of your Friday. Take care, all.